I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, sitting in my favorite corner of the campus library, staring at my phone, and reading what might be the most surreal text message I'd ever received. Hey Ethan, I know this is completely out of the blue, but I really need your help. Could you pretend to be my boyfriend at my cousin's engagement party this Saturday? I'll explain everything. Please? Olivia. Olivia Chen. The girl who sat 2 rows ahead of me in advanced creative writing. The girl whose laugh could illuminate the entire lecture hall. The girl who had no idea I'd been secretly writing poems about her for the past semester. And now she wanted me to pretend to be her boyfriend. I checked the timestamp, 3:47 p.m. The message had arrived exactly 12 minutes ago while I was deep in research for my thesis. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. How does one even respond to such a request? My heart was doing somersaults while my brain attempted to maintain some semblance of dignity. Everything okay? I finally typed, then deleted it. Too casual. I'd be happy to help. Delete. Too eager. Why me? Delete. Too defensive. While I was stuck in this cycle of type and delete, another message from her popped up. I know we don't really hang out outside of class, but you're literally the only person I can trust with this. Coffee at the Golden Bean in 30 minutes? I'll explain everything. My treat. The Golden Bean. Our campus coffee shop where she always ordered a caramel macchiato with an extra shot of espresso and where I'd spent countless hours pretending to work on my laptop while actually watching her study with her friends. Not that I was stalking her or anything, it was just that the Golden Bean had the best writing atmosphere on campus. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Sure, see you there, I replied, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened as I hit send. I packed up my books, my laptop, and what remained of my composure. The walk from the library to the Golden Bean was usually a 7-minute stroll, but today it felt like a journey across time and space. My mind raced with possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Why did she need a fake boyfriend? Why me, of all people? We'd talked maybe a dozen times throughout the semester, mostly about class assignments or borrowed pens. The crisp October air nipped at my cheeks as I walked across the quad, fallen leaves crunching beneath my feet. Our campus was particularly beautiful this time of year, with the old brick buildings wrapped in ivy that had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. But today, I barely noticed any of it. My mind was too busy crafting potential scenarios, each more elaborate than the last. When I pushed open the door to the Golden Bean, the familiar smell of coffee and freshly baked cookies enveloped me. Olivia was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window, 2 steaming cups in front of her. She wore an oversized cream sweater that made her look soft and comfortable, her dark hair falling in gentle waves around her face. When she saw me, she broke into a smile that could have powered the entire coffee shop. Ethan. Thank you so much for coming, she said, pushing one of the cups toward me as I sat down. I got you a black coffee with 1 sugar. I've noticed that's your usual order. She'd noticed my coffee order? I tried not to read too much into that, but my writer's brain was already spinning it into significance. Focus, Ethan. Thanks, I said, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. So, a fake boyfriend, huh? Olivia's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at her own cup. I know it sounds crazy. And I totally understand if you want to say no. It's just. She took a deep breath, and when she looked up, I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before: vulnerability. My cousin Lauren is getting engaged. She's having this huge party this Saturday, and my entire family will be there. Including my grandmother from China, who's been asking about my love life every single day since she arrived last month. And my ex-boyfriend, James, who's Lauren's fiance's best friend. She paused to take a sip of her coffee, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. James and I broke up 6 months ago. It was messy. He cheated on me with his study partner, and everyone in my family loved him so much that I couldn't bear to tell them the real reason we broke up. I just said we wanted different things. But now he's bringing his new girlfriend to the party, the same girl he cheated with, and I just. She trailed off, biting her lower lip. You don't want to look like you're still hung up on him, I finished for her. Exactly. She leaned forward, her eyes lighting up with relief that I understood. My grandmother has been trying to set me up with every eligible Chinese guy she knows, and if I show up alone, it's going to be an interrogation about why I let such a nice boy like James go, followed by a parade of potential suitors. I can't deal with that. Not right now. I took a sip of my coffee, using those few seconds to process everything. And you chose me because you're kind, she said immediately, then seemed embarrassed by her quick response. I mean, I've seen how you are in class. You always help people understand the assignments, you're patient with everyone's feedback during workshops, and you never make anyone feel stupid for asking questions. Plus, you're a writer, so I know you can think on your feet if anyone asks questions about our relationship. She made air quotes around the word relationship, and something in my chest tightened. Also, she continued, you're one of the few guys I know who James doesn't know. He never took any English classes, said creative writing was a waste of time. She rolled her eyes. And I don't know. You just feel safe. Safe. The word echoed in my head. Was that a good thing? Being the safe choice? The party is this Saturday, she continued, apparently taking my silence as hesitation. It's at the Grand Marina Hotel downtown. I know it's a lot to ask, but it would just be for one evening. I'll handle all the details, create a believable backstory for us, coach you on my family members, everything. And of course, I'll owe you big time. I should have taken more time to think about it. Should have asked more questions. Should have considered all the ways this could go wrong. But sitting there, watching the sunlight play across her worried face, there was only one answer I could give. Okay, I said. I'll do it. The smile that broke across her face was like watching the sun come out after a storm. Really? Oh my God, Ethan, thank you. You're literally saving my life. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I tried to ignore the way my skin tingled where she touched me. But, I added, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, if we're going to make this convincing, we should probably spend some time together before Saturday. You know, get our story straight, learn about each other. Make it believable. Of course. She pulled out her phone, already typing frantically. I have classes until 4 o'clock tomorrow, but after that, I'm free. We could meet here again? Or maybe grab dinner? We should probably be seen together on campus a few times before Saturday anyway, just in case anyone asks questions. As she spoke, laying out plans and possibilities, I couldn't help but notice how her eyes sparkled with excitement, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, how her hands moved animatedly as she talked. And sitting there, watching her plan our fake relationship with such enthusiasm, I realized I might have just made either the best or worst decision of my life. Because here's the thing about being a writer, we're trained to notice details. To read between the lines. To see the story beneath the story. And right now, every detail I noticed about Olivia Chen was telling me I was in serious trouble. The way my heart raced when she smiled? The way I couldn't stop staring at her hands? The way I'd already started mentally composing the story of this moment? These weren't the reactions of someone preparing to play a part. These were the reactions of someone already falling in love. And as I sat there, nodding along to her plans and trying to keep my face neutral, I realized that pretending to be Olivia Chen's boyfriend might not be the hardest part of this arrangement. The hardest part would be pretending I wasn't already half in love with her. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a story that would change both our lives in ways neither of us could have imagined. Because sometimes the most dangerous games we play aren't the ones we plan, but the ones our hearts decide to play without our permission. And my heart? It was already several chapters ahead of my head. The next few days passed in a blur of coffee meetings, shared meals, and what Olivia called a relationship boot camp. We had 3 days to create a convincing love story, and she approached it with the same determination she brought to her literary analysis essays. Okay, she said Wednesday afternoon, spreading out a notebook on our now regular table at the Golden Bean. We need to nail down our story. How did we get together? I watched as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I'd come to recognize as her getting down to business move. The late afternoon sun streaming through the window created a halo around her, and I had to remind myself this was all pretend. Well, I started, trying to focus on the task at hand rather than how beautiful she looked. We should keep it as close to the truth as possible. Makes it easier to remember. Smart. She nodded approvingly. So, we met in creative writing class. And I was immediately captivated by your interpretation of Joyce's Araby during the third week of class, I added, letting a bit of truth slip into our fabrication. Olivia's eyes widened. You remember that discussion? Of course I remembered. She talked about unrequited love and the pain of idealization with such passion that I'd filled 3 pages of my notebook with her words. But I couldn't tell her that. It was a memorable analysis, I said instead, shrugging. Anyway, maybe we started talking more after that? Study sessions that turned into coffee dates? Perfect. She scribbled in her notebook. First kiss? I nearly choked on my coffee. What? We need to have our story straight, she said, all business. Someone's bound to ask. Maybe, 2 weeks ago? After the midnight poetry reading at the Bookmark Cafe? The Bookmark Cafe was a cozy bookstore just off campus that hosted monthly poetry readings. I'd seen her there a few times, always wanting to say hello but never quite finding the courage. That works, I managed. It was raining that night. We could say I walked you home, and the streetlights were reflecting off the wet pavement, she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. And you quoted Pablo Neruda. I love you without knowing how, or when, or from where, I recited automatically, then immediately regretted it when I saw her surprised expression. You know Neruda? English major, I reminded her, hoping my face wasn't as red as it felt. We, covered him in world poetry last semester. She smiled softly. It's perfect. Romantic but believable. My family will love it. We spent the next hour creating a detailed timeline of our fictional relationship, complete with first dates, inside jokes, and minor disagreements we'd overcome. It was like co-writing a story, except I was also a character in it, and every detail we added felt like both a gift and a torture. Now, she said, closing her notebook with a satisfied snap, we need to work on physical comfort. We can't look awkward around each other at the party. My heart started doing jumping jacks. What do you mean? Well, couples have a certain way of being around each other, right? Little touches, inside jokes, finishing each other's sentences. We need to practice that. Which is how I found myself spending the next 2 days engaged in what can only be described as an elaborate game of pretend, except every moment felt devastatingly real to me. We held hands walking across campus, her fingers intertwined with mine as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. We shared meals at the campus cafe, where she'd steal fries from my plate and I'd pretend to be annoyed. We sat close together in the library, shoulders touching as we studied, and each point of contact felt like a spark against my skin. Thursday evening, we were at her apartment, practicing dancing for the party. She'd pushed her furniture against the walls to create a makeshift dance floor, and soft music played from her speakers. My family loves to dance, she explained, stepping into my arms. We need to look natural. Her head rested against my chest as we swayed to the music, and I silently thanked my mother for those ballroom dancing lessons she'd insisted on when I was younger. Olivia smelled like vanilla and coffee, and holding her felt like holding a dream I'd never dared to have. You're good at this, she murmured. The dancing or the pretending? She lifted her head to look at me, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes that made my breath catch. But then she smiled and laid her head back on my chest. Both, she said softly. Friday night, we decided to do a trial run at a local restaurant, practicing our couple routine in public. Olivia wore a dark blue dress that made her look like starlight given human form, and I had to keep reminding myself this was just rehearsal. Tell me about your family, I said over pasta, realizing I needed to know these things for tomorrow. She told me about her grandmother, who'd left China during the Cultural Revolution and never lost her determination to see her family succeed. About her parents, who ran a successful restaurant in the city and worked harder than anyone she knew. About her cousin Lauren, who'd been more like a sister growing up. And now tell me about James, I said quietly, knowing we needed to discuss him but hating the way her expression clouded at his name. She twirled pasta around her fork, not meeting my eyes. What do you want to know? Whatever you think I should know for tomorrow. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her gathering her thoughts. We dated for 2 years. Met at a business school mixer. I was there with a friend. He was charming. Confident. The kind of guy who seemed to have everything figured out. My family loved him because he had this 10-year plan, you know? Good job lined up, investment portfolio, the whole package. What happened? I asked, even though she'd already told me the basics. I found out he'd been seeing his study partner for months. Sarah. She said the name like it tasted bitter. They're still together. She's who he's bringing tomorrow. Without thinking, I reached across the table and took her hand. She looked up, surprised, but didn't pull away. Their loss is my gain, I said, trying to stay in character but meaning every word. Even if it's just pretend. Something shifted in her expression then, something I couldn't quite read. She squeezed my hand and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. You know what's funny, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes this doesn't feel like pretending at all. My heart stopped, then started again at double speed. But before I could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from her cousin about tomorrow's party, and the moment shattered like glass. Later that night, walking her home under a sky full of stars, I couldn't help but think about how easy it had been to fall into this routine with her. How natural it felt to hold her hand, to learn the rhythm of her laugh, to know exactly how she liked her coffee and which songs made her dance. Thank you for doing this, she said as we reached her door. I know it's a lot to ask. It's no problem, I lied, because how could I tell her that every moment of pretending was simultaneously the best and worst thing that had ever happened to me? She hesitated at her door, then stood on her tiptoes and kissed my cheek. For practice, she whispered, then disappeared inside before I could respond. I stood there for a long moment, my cheek burning where her lips had touched it, wondering how I was going to survive tomorrow's party when just a practice kiss felt like a lightning strike to my soul. Because here's the thing about pretending, sometimes it feels more real than reality. Sometimes the lines blur until you can't remember what's act and what's truth. And sometimes, in the space between fiction and fact, your heart forgets it's all just make-believe. Tomorrow, I would have to pretend to be in love with Olivia Chen in front of her entire family. The irony was, I wouldn't have to pretend at all. The real acting would come afterward, when I'd have to pretend I wasn't heartbroken when it all came to an end. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed almost too good to be true, much like everything else in my life lately. I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting my tie for the 1000th time. Olivia had chosen it for me yesterday during our last-minute shopping trip, deep blue silk that she said brought out my eyes. You clean up nice, my roommate Jake commented from the doorway. Got a hot date? If only he knew. Something like that, I muttered, running a hand through my carefully styled hair. Engagement party. Jake whistled. Meeting the family already? Must be serious. I caught my own eye in the mirror and had to look away. If he only knew how not serious it was. Or maybe how serious it was, just not in the way anyone would expect. My phone buzzed with a text from Olivia, "Car's here. You ready?" She'd insisted on hiring a car service for the evening, saying it would look more impressive than showing up in my beat-up Honda Civic. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, trying to quiet the symphony of butterflies in my stomach. The car was a sleek black sedan, and Olivia was already inside. When I opened the door, my heart stopped dead in my chest. She wore a burgundy dress that hugged her curves before flowing out at the hips, her hair swept up in an elegant twist with a few artful strands framing her face. She looked like something out of a dream. "Hi," she said softly, and I realized I'd been staring. "Hi," I managed, sliding in beside her. "You look incredible." A blush crept across her cheeks. "Thanks." You look pretty incredible yourself. She reached out and straightened my tie, her fingers lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Ready for this? As I'll ever be. The Grand Marina Hotel lived up to its name, with its sweeping marble staircases and crystal chandeliers. The engagement party was being held in the ballroom, which overlooked the harbor. As we walked in, Olivia's hand found mine, and I gave it a reassuring squeeze. Olivia! A voice called out, and suddenly we were surrounded by a whirlwind of familiar faces from the photos she'd shown me. Her cousin Lauren, the bride-to-be, rushed forward to envelope her in a hug. You look amazing. And this must be Ethan. I smiled and shook hands, played my part perfectly. Congratulations on your engagement. Olivia's told me so much about you. All good things, I hope, Lauren laughed, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. Grandma's been asking about you all day. She's so excited to meet Olivia's new man. As if summoned by her words, an elderly woman in an elegant cheapao appeared at Lauren's elbow. Olivia's grandmother had the kind of presence that commanded attention, her eyes sharp and assessing as they moved between Olivia and me. Ah, so this is the writer, she said in accented English, giving me an appraising look. Olivia says you understand the power of stories. I bowed slightly, remembering what Olivia had taught me about showing respect. Stories are how we make sense of life, Mama, I said, using the term of respect Olivia had coached me on. They're how we remember what matters. Something approved flickered in her eyes. Good answer. Better than the last one, who only understood numbers. I felt Olivia tense beside me and squeezed her hand again. Her grandmother noticed the gesture and smiled. Come, she said, tell me how you met. Olivia says it was very romantic. We moved through the crowd, telling our carefully crafted story. I watched Olivia's face as she described our first kiss in the rain, adding little details we hadn't rehearsed but that felt natural. The way I'd supposedly offered her my jacket. How we'd gotten completely soaked but didn't care. How the moment had felt perfect despite, or perhaps because of, the rain. And now, her grandmother asked. What are your intentions? Mama. Olivia protested, but I just smiled. Right now, my intention is to make her happy, I said honestly. Everything else, we'll figure out as we go. The answer seemed to satisfy her, and she patted my cheek before moving off to greet other guests. As soon as she was gone, Olivia released a breath. You're amazing at this, she whispered. She totally loves you. Before I could respond, the music changed to a slow song, and couples began moving to the dance floor. Olivia's eyes met mine, and without a word, we joined them. We'd practiced this, but somehow it felt different here, under the soft lights with her family watching. Her head found its place on my shoulder like it belonged there, and we swayed to the music. This is nice, she murmured. Yeah, I agreed, trying not to think about how perfectly she fit in my arms. We should. Well. If it isn't the English major. The voice cut through our moment like a knife, and I felt Olivia stiffen in my arms. We turned to find a tall, well-dressed man standing there with a blonde woman beside him. Even without the introductions, I knew exactly who they were. James and Sarah. He looked exactly like the type of guy who'd have a 10-year plan, expensive watch, perfect haircut, the kind of smile that probably closed million-dollar deals. Sarah hung on his arm like an accessory, her designer dress and perfectly manicured nails screaming old money. James, Olivia said, her voice steady despite the way her fingers tightened on my arm. Enjoying the party? Immensely, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Aren't you going to introduce us to your friend? I stepped forward slightly, positioning myself between him and Olivia. Ethan Zhang, I said, extending my hand. Olivia's boyfriend. You must be the ex I've heard so much about. His handshake was too firm, a power play I recognized from countless business majors I'd met. All good things, I hope? Actually, you rarely come up, I said pleasantly. We have more interesting things to talk about. Sarah shifted uncomfortably beside him, but James's smile just grew sharper. Really? Like what? Poetry? Among other things, I replied, matching his tone. You know what they say about creative types, we're full of surprises. James, Sarah tugged at his arm. We should go say hello to the others. But he wasn't done. You know, Olivia, he said, ignoring his girlfriend, I was surprised to hear you were seeing someone. Especially so soon after, well, you know. I felt Olivia take a step forward, but before she could speak, I did. Actually, I said, my voice low enough that only our small group could hear, I should thank you, James. If you hadn't been stupid enough to cheat on the most amazing woman I've ever met, I never would have had a chance with her. So, really, your loss is my gain. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to dance with my girlfriend. Without waiting for a response, I led Olivia back to the dance floor. As soon as we were far enough away, she let out a shaky breath. That was incredible, she whispered. How did you know? About the cheating? You told me, I reminded her gently. Right, she said, but something in her voice had changed. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Ethan, Olivia. Come quick. Lauren appeared suddenly beside us. Grandma's about to give her speech, and she wants you and Ethan at the main table. As we followed Lauren through the crowd, I couldn't help but notice that Olivia's hand was shaking slightly in mine. Something had shifted during that confrontation with James, but I couldn't tell what. The way she'd looked at me, it was almost like she was seeing me for the first time. What I didn't know then was that this night was about to take several unexpected turns. Because sometimes the most convincing performances are the ones where you're not acting at all, and sometimes the truth has a way of coming out in the most unexpected ways. And as we took our seats at the main table, with Olivia's hand still firmly in mine, I had no idea that the real drama of the evening was just about to begin. Olivia's grandmother stood at the head of the table, holding a champagne glass with an elegance that seemed to belong to another era. The room fell silent as she began to speak, first in Mandarin, then in English, her words weaving together tradition and modernity, past and present. Love, she said, her eyes sweeping across the room, is not about perfect moments. It is about perfect efforts. It is about choosing someone every day, even when it is difficult. Especially when it is difficult. Her gaze lingered on Olivia and me for a moment, and I felt Olivia's hand tighten in mine. When I left China, she continued, I left everything I knew behind. But I brought with me the most important lesson, that true love is not about grand gestures or fancy words. It is about the small things. The quiet moments. The silent understanding. As she spoke, I couldn't help but think about the past few days with Olivia. The way she'd memorized my coffee order. The way I'd learned to recognize her different smiles. The way we'd fallen into sync without even trying. Were those the small things her grandmother was talking about? Lauren, Michael, she raised her glass to the engaged couple, may your love be built on truth and trust. May it weather all storms. And may you always choose each other, even when the choice is hard. The room erupted in applause and cheers, but I barely heard them. Because at that moment, Olivia had turned to look at me with tears in her eyes. I need some air, she whispered, standing abruptly. I followed her out onto the terrace, concern overriding everything else. The harbor stretched out before us, city lights reflecting off the water like scattered stars. Olivia stood at the railing, her shoulders shaking slightly. Hey, I said softly, placing my jacket around her shoulders. What's wrong? She turned to face me, and the raw emotion in her eyes took my breath away. Everything, she whispered. Everything is wrong. This whole night, it's all wrong. My heart plummeted. Did I do something? No. She cut me off, stepping closer. That's just it, Ethan. You've been perfect. Too perfect. The way you handled James, the way you charmed my family, the way you. She broke off, running a hand through her hair in frustration, displacing several carefully arranged strands. Do you know what my grandmother just said to me? I shook my head, afraid to speak. She said she's never seen me look at anyone the way I look at you. Not even James. She laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. And the worst part is, she's right. My heart was beating so hard I was sure she could hear it. Olivia. Let me finish, she said, holding up a hand. These past few days, pretending to be your girlfriend, it didn't feel like pretending at all. And I kept telling myself it was just because you're a good actor, because we're both writers who know how to tell a convincing story. But then tonight, when you confronted James. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the tears clinging to her eyelashes. You didn't say anything we hadn't rehearsed. But the way you said it, the way you looked at him, at me. She took a shaky breath. Nobody's ever defended me like that. Nobody's ever looked at me like that. Like what? I barely recognized my own voice. Like I'm the most important person in the room. Like I'm worth fighting for. She reached up, her hand hovering near my face but not quite touching. Like you're not pretending at all. The world seemed to stop spinning. All I could see was Olivia, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, and all I could think was that this moment felt both completely impossible and absolutely inevitable. I wasn't, I whispered. Her hand fell to her side. What? I wasn't pretending. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Not about any of it. Not about thinking you're amazing, or wanting to protect you, or. I swallowed hard. Or being in love with you. She stared at me, her eyes wide. How long? Since the third week of class, I admitted. Since your analysis of Araby. You talked about unrequited love with such understanding, such depth, and I've been writing poems about you ever since. Poems, she whispered. I nodded, feeling strangely light now that the truth was coming out. Dozens of them. About your laugh, your mind, the way you gesture when you're excited about a book, the way you. I never got to finish that sentence, because suddenly Olivia's lips were on mine, and every poem I'd ever written about her paled in comparison to the reality of this moment. Her hands were in my hair, my arms were around her waist, and everything else, the party, our pretense, the whole world, faded away. When we finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, she rested her forehead against mine. I think, she said softly, we've both been doing a lot of pretending. Before I could respond, a gasp from behind us made us turn. There, standing in the terrace doorway, was James. And from the look on his face, he'd heard everything. So, he said, his voice cold, it was all a lie? The perfect couple routine? He laughed bitterly. And here I was, actually feeling jealous. Wondering if I'd made a mistake. But you're both just frauds, aren't you? Olivia tensed beside me, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the night air. The only fraud here is you, young man. Olivia's grandmother stepped onto the terrace, her expression fierce despite her small stature. She walked over to stand between us and James, her back straight as steel. You think love is about appearances? About perfect stories and proper timing? She shook her head. These two, their story may have started as pretense, but what I saw tonight was more real than anything you ever showed my granddaughter. James opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand, silencing him. I have lived long enough to know that sometimes the truest love grows from the seeds of pretense. Like a flower breaking through concrete, it finds a way. She turned to look at us, her eyes soft. The question is not how the love began, but whether it is real now. I looked at Olivia, finding my own wonder and uncertainty reflected in her eyes. Were we ready for this? For the complications that would come with turning our pretense into reality? For the questions and the judgment and the risk of it all falling apart? But then Olivia smiled, that brilliant, beautiful smile that had captured my heart months ago, and I knew that some questions answer themselves. What we didn't know then was that this moment on the terrace would become its own kind of story. One that would be told at future family gatherings, embellished and romanticized, but never quite capturing the perfect imperfection of how it really happened. Because sometimes the best love stories aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that surprise us, that grow in the spaces between truth and fiction, that turn our carefully constructed pretenses into something beautifully, unexpectedly real. But the night wasn't over yet. And as we stood there, caught between exposure and liberation, between ending and beginning, we had no idea that the biggest surprise was still to come. Time has a funny way of moving in crucial moments. Sometimes it stretches like taffy, making seconds feel like hours. Other times it rushes past like a river after rain, carrying you along before you can catch your breath. That night on the terrace seemed to do both at once. After James stormed off and Olivia's grandmother gave us a knowing smile before returning to the party, we were left alone again. The harbor lights twinkled below us, and the music from the ballroom drifted out in soft waves, creating a moment that felt somehow both surreal and more real than anything I'd ever experienced. "So," Olivia said, turning to face me with a mix of vulnerability and mischief in her eyes, "poems, huh?" I felt my face heat up. "Yeah, well. I want to hear them," she said, stepping closer. "All of them." "They're not very good," I warned, even as my heart soared at her interest. "Most of them are just fragments. Lines about how the sunlight catches in your hair during morning classes, or how your laugh sounds like the best kind of poetry." She silenced me with another kiss, softer this time but no less electric than the first. "Those sound perfect to me," she whispered against my lips. A throat clearing behind us made us jump apart. Lauren stood in the doorway, trying and failing to suppress a grin. "Sorry to interrupt what is clearly a very important conversation," she said, not looking sorry at all, "but Grandma's about to start the traditional family photos, and she's insisting that both of you be in them." Olivia and I exchanged startled looks. "But we're not," she started. "Please," Lauren rolled her eyes. "After that showdown with James? After Grandma's speech about real love? You're family now, whether you plan to be or not." As we followed Lauren back inside, Olivia's hand found mine again. But this time, there was no pretense, no performance. Just the simple comfort of fingers interlaced and hearts beating in sync. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of photos, dancing, and stolen glances that held new meaning. Every touch, every smile, every shared look now carried the weight of truth rather than pretense. It was liberating and terrifying all at once. At one point, during a slow dance, Olivia's grandmother cut in. "You know," she said as she took my hand with surprising strength, "in my experience, the best stories are the ones that write themselves." "Even when they don't start the way they're supposed to?" I asked. She laughed, a sound full of wisdom and joy. "Especially then. The greatest love story I know started with my husband pretending to be my tutor so he could spend time with me without my parents knowing. Sometimes pretending opens the door for truth to slip in." As the party wound down, Olivia and I found ourselves back on the terrace, but this time we weren't hiding or pretending. We were just being. "I have a confession," she said, playing with my tie. "Remember when I said I chose you because you seemed safe?" I nodded, remembering how that word had stung at the time. "I lied," she said softly. "I chose you because you terrified me." "What?" She smiled, looking up at me through her lashes. "You terrified me because even before all this, I'd noticed you. The way you really listen when people speak in class. The way you defend other writers during workshops, even when their work isn't great. The way you seem to see straight through people's pretenses to who they really are." My heart was doing somersaults. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because after James, I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust what I felt. It was easier to keep my distance, to focus on my studies, to pretend I wasn't interested in anyone." She laughed softly. "And then when I needed someone to pretend to be my boyfriend, my heart immediately thought of you, and my brain came up with all these logical reasons why you'd be perfect for the role." "And now?" I asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Now I'm done pretending," she said firmly. "Now I want to write our own story, one where we don't have to rehearse our lines or practice our timing. One where we can just be." The following Monday, we walked into creative writing class together, no longer playing parts but simply being ourselves. The professor was discussing the role of truth in fiction, and Olivia and I shared a secret smile. Later that week, at the Golden Bean, I finally showed her my poems. She read them with tears in her eyes, then pulled out her own notebook. "Your turn to read something," she said, pushing it toward me. Inside, I found dozens of short stories, all featuring a character who bore a striking resemblance to me. Stories about quiet observers who saw the beauty in small moments, about writers who spoke volumes in their silence, about love that grew in the margins of other tales. Looks like we've both been writing our story all along, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Just from different perspectives. The best stories usually have multiple viewpoints, she replied with a smile. 3 months later, at Lauren's wedding, we didn't have to pretend anything. When Olivia caught the bouquet, her grandmother's knowing look made us both blush. And later, during the reception, James approached us. I owe you both an apology, he said, looking genuinely contrite. What I saw that night, it made me realize what real love looks like. It's not about plans or appearances. It's about. He gestured vaguely between us, whatever this is. Truth, Olivia said simply, squeezing my hand. Now, a year later, I'm sitting in our spot at the Golden Bean, watching Olivia read a draft of her latest story. The sunlight still catches in her hair the same way it did when I first wrote about it, and her laugh still sounds like the best kind of poetry. Sometimes she catches me staring and asks what I'm thinking about. Sometimes I tell her I'm working on a new poem. Sometimes I tell her the truth, that I'm still amazed by how our story unfolded, how pretense became reality, how fiction became truth. But mostly, I tell her what I've known since that third week of class, when she talked about unrequited love with such understanding that she unknowingly captured my heart, that sometimes the best love stories are the ones we don't see coming, the ones that start with pretense and end with truth, the ones that remind us that reality can be more beautiful than any fiction we could create. And now, as I watch her read, I'm no longer pretending not to be in love. I'm simply living it, writing our story day by day, word by word, heart by heart. Because in the end, that's what love is, not a performance, not a practice, not a pretense, but a truth that writes itself in the quiet moments between two hearts that were always meant to beat as one.